And so this also gets at this issue that I've been talking about quality over quantity. A lot of people just think, oh, I should publish a lot. And unfortunately, I see this a lot on academic Twitter. It's just be like, we need to publish more papers, publish more papers. And that will help you to a point, but eventually people are going to read those papers. And I've been on lots of job searches where if people have papers that aren't that solid or interesting or well done or rigorous, it doesn't help you. In fact, it helps you more if people, and I've been this person in meetings where I'm like, a job candidate comes up and I'm like, I've read 2 of their papers that are excellent. Or someone will say that it carries a lot more weight once you actually get into those real decision-making discussions. And so thinking about how you can make quality over quantity is probably a better long-term strategy, especially early in your career, because you don't really have much time to be super productive. Although it does help if you can collaborate to be second or third or fourth author on other people's projects, or find ways to get out other papers. It might be theoretical and conceptual commentaries. So having more papers does help, but only if they're more solid and only if you have a couple ones that are really solid, I think. And another thing that I should say is a lot of people think the quality of journal, the impact factor of the journal, is the main index of quality and impact. It correlates with impact, but the impact of journals is driven often by a small number of papers. And so I think it's correlated with impact, but it's not the same thing. And so a lot of papers that have become really important in the field are ones that were obscure at first, published in obscure journals. Sometimes it's journals you might not have even heard of, but they were really theoretically innovative or introduced a new concept that the field wasn't ready for. So they couldn't get published in a top journal, but came to be incredibly important. And once people read them, were compelled by them. So I don't want you just to get obsessed with the type of journal that you're in. Again, I think that's correlated because it's harder to get in the top journals. A lot of times the work in those journals is really innovative, but don't get surprised by it. You're gonna have to eventually read the papers on your own and draw your own conclusion. And so this notion of publish or perish is a bit of a misnomer. And I also just wanna zoom out. My advisor always reminded me, like, publishing for the sake of publishing is not really the goal of science. Your goal is to like have something interesting you want to say or contribute and then contribute it. And that's hard when you're starting in your career. For me, I have lots of thoughts and conceptual things I want to contribute, but even at the time I went up for tenure, I didn't really have, I think I had like 1 paper or 2 papers that were like partially theoretical. There weren't really any new theories or models in them. Now I have lots of ideas, but it comes over time. So, but the point here is that publishing is necessary to advance the field, because if you don't publish what you're doing, no one will read about it or hear about it, and it will have 0 impact. And it will be the same as if you didn't do anything. So publishing is really the fundamental step in science. That's why we talk about it. But if it's not advancing the field in some way, it's not contributing much. And it's the same with your dissertation. Your dissertation is going to be better if you are making an interesting contribution. And if you've published it and gone through peer review, you can put that paper in your dissertation. It's going to be more rigorous, and it's going to have been vetted in a way that your dissertation committee is going to be impressed by. You'll have already thought through a lot of critiques and have answers for them. So if you can publish stuff, it's great for putting together a dissertation. Some places like NYU have 3-paper dissertations. So publishing is useful for moving forward your dissertation. It advances science, because if you don't publish it, it is completely meaningless what you did, essentially, because no one will learn from it. And it helps you gain employment in the field. It can help you gain employment in non-academic jobs as well. So publishing is important, but the goal is to have something to say in the publication is the most important. And I would say this quality over quantity thing applies to all these domains that I would do. When I started, I had a huge lab with lots of research assistants. When I was a grad student, I had this huge team of like 10 research assistants. It was bad. I didn't have time to help mentor them and give them advice, and they didn't have stuff to do. And so it was kind of a wasted opportunity for them. I didn't have time to build up different skills for them. Same with the lab. At one point I had 7 PhD students. Now I have 4, soon I'm gonna have 2. And I've capped my lab at 3. And so it's like, I realize I can't do the quality work I want, and it's not as fun when you do too much stuff, and they don't get the same benefits from it. Same with presentations. I'm now saying no to most of the presentation opportunities. For you young, you're trying to get as many opportunities as you can, but eventually you're going to reach a threshold where you have to start saying no more. And I don't know for each of you where you are, but think about this as you go up. Eventually the quality over quantity trade-offs are going to become more significant. At first you're trying to get something done and get anything going. But eventually then there's a trade-off. You have too many projects, more projects than you can handle or write up. And at that point, you really need to be focusing, every new thing should only be going if it's higher quality than the current thing that you're being held up on. And it's the same with teaching. I found my teaching is better by focusing on quality. Shorter lectures that focus on fewer concepts are more fun. The students remember them more, they're more engaged. If I try to teach them everything on a topic, it's overwhelming to them, and they don't have the mental capacity or understanding to get into the nuance. And so thinking about this across all of these different domains turns out to be an incredibly helpful piece of advice that I recommend for all elements of your career. And so this, as you go up, the key is saying no. And it's by saying no to a lot of things that we're able to concentrate on the things that are really important and make progress. That's another great Steve Jobs quote. And I have a new column that Leah Somerville took the lead on in our science careers thing about advice for saying no. And it gives you, like, Leah actually had examples and texts that she put in here on how to say no in a polite way, or negotiate the actual task you're being asked to do in a way that makes it better for you. But this is a skill in all careers of life. So the sooner you learn it, the better. And you can read the column for more details, but I'll just say some of the things that I think are really useful in this space are, you might ask for a few extra days to make a decision before you say yes, and that gives you time to think about it. When I ask my students or postdocs to be on a project, I'll often say, don't answer me now, think about it for overnight and let me know tomorrow if you want to do it. So they don't feel pressured in the moment, or don't make a rash decision and then they're not really motivated to do it in the long run. So it's better for everybody if they've thought about it. Another trick you can do, because we engage in temporal discounting, where we think, we don't value things for ourselves in the future, is think, would I be willing to do this next week or the week after? If not, say no, because that means you're not going to want to do it 52 weeks from now. You're going to be just as busy 52 weeks from now as you are now. So don't think just because your calendar is empty 52 weeks from now, that it's going to be empty 51 weeks from now when you actually get close to it. And the most important thing is think of opportunity costs. Every time you take a new thing on, it means you don't have time for the current things you have or you're working on. So to say no, I think always be kind and prompt in saying no if you can. And often what I try to do is recommend someone else who's qualified and actually might want the opportunity, often an earlier career person who can benefit from it. And people who are asking are often excited because they're just looking for someone to do the thing. And so if you can recommend someone else who's good, who actually might want to do it and can gain something from it, and then the person asking you can get advice about someone who's really smart and qualified in that space, then you get a win-win for everybody and a win for yourself if it's something you couldn't take on. But don't say no to everything. I also want to say there's always a caveat for every piece of advice. You have to be a good member of your community. And by doing your share of service to the field, it's really important that you do your fair share of reviews and service work and stuff. And so don't just be a free rider, is the term we use in the cooperation social dilemma literature. So make sure you do your share of community events. But don't spread yourself too thin, because then you drop everything. So I made this mistake many times in grad school. It's often the people who are most ambitious and excited and energized who make this mistake, because they want to do all the things. So I had so many lines of research going that I never finished. I dropped the ball on, and the professors I was working with were irritated because they wasted time on me. And it's much easier to opt into something than to opt out, because once people have sunk costs, they engage in the sunk cost fallacy. So saying no before is much smarter than saying no but once you've started on something. But you have to sometimes say no once you've started if you can't do it. And it's important to be fair and transparent to people and honest with them about what you can and cannot do. And it's really hard if you're doing interdisciplinary work, because you can end up doing a bad job on both the disciplines you're supposed to be learning about. And you can run the risk of kind of getting lost or not knowing about it, and then the science suffers. So you need to think, especially if you're interdisciplinary, very carefully about what you're going to do and what constraints you have, or have collaborators who can make sure that you're not missing something. Because otherwise you can just completely get confused and get lost and spread yourself too thin. So my advice when you're starting out is to focus on 1 or 2 lines of research where you're the lead, and 1 of the 2 lines maybe where you're a junior collaborator. And ideally, these all cohere around a big idea, even if they're in different labs or different mentors or collaborators. And I recommend don't really expand into yet another line of research until you have control of at least one, where you're getting some findings and it's moving forward, or you've sent the paper out and now you'll free yourself up to do something else, or being ready to drop something. So I'll say this for me, I've been overwhelmed with the pandemic and all my students and projects. I've taken myself off about 5 projects in the last year, or said no to invitations to do things with collaborators at other universities. And so this is something you just have to do more and more as you go through your career. And if you are in a few projects, so it can be useful because it helps manage risk. So if you know anything about finances and investing in the stock market, and you want to have a diversified portfolio. And this means from science perspective and your career perspective, it's helpful to have these bold, high risk ideas that if they work out are going to be great and blockbusters like we talked about. But you manage risk by having some safer, more incremental work. And especially useful if you have a line of research that's going, or you have a collaborator or a mentor who's doing something, and you know that if you plug into that line of research, it's going to be replicable and you can extend it in simple ways. So it's actually really useful for you to have a diverse portfolio, just like if you were investing, because then your future is more protected. So my opinion is once you have more data than you have time to write it up, most new studies going forward should be high risk, high reward. And so once you have a sufficient amount of just stuff that's showing something interesting that's publishable or in your dissertation or whatnot, at that point, you should only be taking on new things that are probably pretty bold and high risk, high reward. It's kind of a luxury that you have as you get to that stage. And it's also useful for you to always be thinking about how your work coheres. Again, because it's much better for your dissertation, for if you want to go an academic job, even might be helpful if you want to go a non-academic job to be able to claim you have this specific expertise. And so you can take a classic top-down approach. In our department at NYU, this is how, you often have a big theory and you're working on work that tests and follows up that big theory. Or you can have like multiple lines of research that are all on a theme, a specific topic. But you have to be careful if you get too obsessed with your theory, because there's lots of research on this, and perhaps the most important book in the history of science philosophy suggests that you end up like missing things that are really important. And so there's lots of moments in history where scientists could have had a groundbreaking finding, like discovering oxygen, but they didn't know what they were looking for because they were so locked into a way of thinking that they completely missed something. And it took 50 years later for someone else to discover it and get the credit for it. And so science is full of things like this. And the same thing happens with theory. You're not listening to findings that are not replicating, or anomalous findings that are like showing the opposite of your theory. And you're not integrating them into your thinking. You're going to miss out maybe on something that would even be bigger and more impactful and would force a new theoretical or paradigmatic shift in the field. So you should be always being open-minded to new findings and new patterns, rather than just like seeing everything through a lens makes you, if you see this all the time as a rabbit because you're focused on looking at rabbits, you'll miss that it's also potentially a duck. And so don't turn your research into this motivated perception where you're always seeing what you want to see. And so that's why I think it's really important also to zoom out and be open-minded to different patterns or pathways. And there, again, this is probably my favorite science quote of all time, that the most exciting phase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not eureka, but that's funny. And I have these meetings with people and my students and postdocs when I'm working, and when they send me a finding that like goes in the opposite direction we predicted, it's often more interesting, if assuming it replicates, because it means if you didn't predict it, it likely means that the field wouldn't have predicted it. And if the field wouldn't have predicted it, it means that there's an opportunity for innovation, that there's a lesson to be learned, and that you might have stumbled on something big. So that's why you don't always want to be obsessed with your theory. You always want to be ready for this eureka moment. And so in reality, of course, like everything that most advice I'm giving you, there's a third way, which is have your programmatic theory-driven research with your exploratory studies. A lot of science is discovering right now that just mapping out a space sometimes leads to the most interesting findings. So this is often described as descriptive research, which some of your advisors might be turn their nose up at descriptive research, but sometimes descriptive research is often the most innovative and interesting because it lays out things we're not thinking about that might be right in front of our eyes. And so try to design open-ended rather than just confirmatory studies. Be guided by your theory, but listen to your data, and be ready to let your theory evolve. And your research question, as you find new things, you should not be thinking the same way now that you thought 5 years ago on a topic. If you have, it means your research is incredibly stagnant. So always be trying to like move your thinking forward with your own work and other papers and work that you're reading. And so in science and in our graduate training, we're often trained to be analytical and critical. And this is what grad seminars often, everybody just picks apart papers and finds a little holes in their methods. And if a little bit, if you go on academic Twitter, this is kind of the vibe. But and that's good as a baseline. It's essential to science. It's the lifeblood of science. But if you're not being open to what's being discovered or what you might discover or learn from something or the potential advantages of that piece of knowledge, you're never going to like advance your thinking on things. So it's important to have this balance, the yin and the yang of science, I think of it. So be critical and skeptical a lot, but sometimes you have to give it a break. Don't just try to spend your whole time trying to bring people down. Don't try to just always look for confirmatory evidence, look for anomalies. This is like the Thomas Kuhn lesson rather than, Mark Hauser's this guy who like got disbarred from science, lost his job at Harvard because he was always respinning his data in a way that confirmed his theory. And interpreting findings and data points in his lab, and his students eventually reported him for it. He lost his job, and a lot of his papers were withdrawn. So don't go down that road. That's the road of trying to always confirm your thinking, and try to eventually connect it in a way that makes sense and coheres, and it allows kind of a puzzle to be explored, or you allow people to connect the dots in an area rather than just a bunch of random data points. Find a way that makes sense of all of them, so that they're not just a bunch of dots of data points, that they actually show something and reveal something to science and to humanity. And for this, and this is, we'll wind down the talk here. My best ideas often come from stepping away from the data. And this often comes from like talking to somebody outside my field, having a shower, where the thing about shower for innovation is that you're not distracted. You don't have your smartphone in front of you or your computer or your paper. Your mind wanders. And so it's putting things together in ways that might be very creative. Sometimes I had my best ideas right before I fall asleep. Again, it's that moment of the day where I'm not thinking about anything. My mind's just wandering and connecting things. And so make time and find time to have conversations, to not be distracted and to think about things. If you're doing, the moment that you find the least amount of new ideas comes from often just sitting at your computer doing your thing or being on social media, or doing 2 or more things at the same time where you're distracted. So carve out time to think. And the big picture here is it's helpful because again, eventually you might have to do a dissertation or write a job research statement to start thinking about how things might cohere in a way. So this is an exercise to always be putting yourself through is how do the things cohere? What are the connections? And that might also tell you about missing blind spots you have. And you want to be audacious about doing big and bold things, but you also don't want to be just trying to like confirm everything to prove something or to get the next paper. This is just like a lineup of people who've done unethical work by p-hacking, manipulating data, interpreting data that they shouldn't have in ways that confirm their theory. And eventually it often comes out. There's all kinds of ways of detecting fraud. So you want to take this long view of science, of discovery and learning. And the analogy that I think of is like Lance Armstrong, cutting corners to win. He is now, his name's synonymous with fraudulent behavior. And yet all his titles stripped, lost enormous amount of his wealth and his fame and his foundation, all the good things he did. And that same thing happens in science. If you get caught, you end up in this kind of scientific hell, for trying to get ahead. And so don't always just think in terms of like getting the paper. Think about doing something interesting and good and trying to learn something that you're going to honestly report to people. And so don't just hide your null effects or only publish the things that show evidence for you, or obviously like make up data or hide all your outliers. You want to be open about what you find with your data, your materials. You can pre-register your studies, and that way you can publish any kind of finding. So there's lots of guidelines. There's been a whole innovation in the last few years, but a lot of the guidelines about good research align with all these things I've been saying about discovery, about rigor, about boldness. It requires a lot of boldness to get a huge sample that's diverse, to replicate it, to pre-register it. And so thinking about the long view is different when you're young. I used to think about like, I just needed some publications. I didn't really care about how good they were. And I have some papers, my first paper I ever submitted, it got rejected. And one of the reviewers pointed out there's a major confound. And I remember emailing the editor back and saying, thank you for this. And I've never published it because it was so confounded. And I'm so happy that that wasn't published with my name on it. And so my thinking on this started to change then, and has changed over time, is that the older I get more satisfaction when I'm really doing something I love, that's exciting, that's intrinsically enjoyable. Or when I have a colleague who emails me a compliment about a paper that they read of ours or replicated it, or someone cites it and they found it actually useful. Those are the things that give me kind of intrinsic satisfaction. The older I get, the more I'm around. Rather than just like getting a paper in is not nearly as exciting to me as these kind of like second order things. So just like the marshmallow task, it helps to think in this long term if you can. Because if you do this well, not only do you get your PhD, which is an incredible rare distinction in society, no one can take away from you, comes with incredible possibilities and probabilities for job security in all kinds of fields, including in the pandemic. If you look at, as I was saying before, unemployment rates for people with PhDs, it's like 1 or 2%, because they can work from anywhere now, safely. And a lot of the work is like high-end type of stuff. They pay well, they pay dramatically more than if you have your high school or just your BA or BSc. So there's all these advantages in life, but you also get potential for creative freedom. And the things that I love is I get to be my own boss. And a lot of people who go into science outside of academia are starting to get similar perks like this. So there's job stability, creative freedom, more control over what you do. So these are incredible things. So I would normally have a digestion break here and go on, but I'm going to stop here because it's noon, and I'm going to stop the recording, but then I'm going to take questions for a few minutes, and then I'll record another segment of this later, and I'll share it with you because there's still more stuff that I have that just did not have time to go through.